Hi, Laura.
Hi, Bob.
How are you?
Fine, thank you. How are you?
I'm doing well. Let me introduce us. I'm Robert Wright of Blogging Heads TV. You are Lora Saalman, and you are in China. We've never done a Blogging Heads with somebody in China. More specifically, you're at the Carnegie Tsinghua Center for Global Policy, which is, I guess, located at Tsinghua University in Beijing.
That's correct. We're located just outside of their East Gate.
Okay, I've actually been there.
Oh.
And I loved it.
Oh, great.
And you're an associate in the nuclear policy program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, which is the very Carnegie that's mentioned in the Carnegie Tsinghua Center. And it's relevant that you're something of an expert in nuclear policy, because there's a certain amount happening on that front involving China. Specifically in Iran, but I think that even as we speak, there is a Chinese deputy foreign minister or something in Iran consulting with people in Iran, according to the New York Times. And then also there's a story in the New York Times, backers of today's Times. The headline is "Backers of Iran Sanctions Make an Appeal to China." Mm-hmm. This is a bipartisan group of national security types, pretty prominent people, who wrote a letter to President Obama asking him to lobby, I guess, the visiting vice president of China and heir apparent to be the next prime minister. Is that who we're talking about?
Xi Jinping is currently in the United States conducting a visit. So it would make sense that if they wanted to lobby him about anything, now would be a good time.
Right. Thank you for pronouncing that name for me. I may ask you to do that again before we're done. Like every time I have to say it, I may ask you to do the honors. So anyway, they were lobbying Obama to lobby him to get to get China to join the European Union and the United States in these sanctions that would seriously curtail Iran's oil exports. Mm-hmm. And I'm just wondering what that looks like from your perspective. I mean, maybe the prospects of it happening, or what kinds of forces are impinging on the Chinese government as it wrestles with this.
Well, I think in general terms, when it comes to sanctions, China has historically been against them. China's attitude towards sanctions are that they don't work, first of all, and that ultimately you're impinging upon a country's sovereignty in some form or another. And what they're really looking for, and what they emphasize again and again and again with any situation, is maintaining stability, maintaining sovereignty of a country. And sanctions are seen as basically going against the norm within China, in addition to being ineffective. So in this particular instance, it's not that China has never supported sanctions. They've certainly had their share of sanctions in the past that they've signed on to. But in question of whether or not even if they sign on to them, whether or not they will implement them to the full extent that they should be implemented, there are questions regarding that. And that's happened in the case of North Korea. There have been questions in the past on how much they've been willing to come on board in the final equation. And I think you'll see this with Iran as well. And frankly, I think in a larger spectrum, when you really look at the Iranian question for China, sanctions can actually sometimes benefit it, obviously from a business standpoint. In the past, the United States has been the main purveyor of sanctions. And for Chinese businesses, certainly, when you exclude a large market like the United States from the competition, that also benefits them in one way or other. There's always a way around sanctions, in other words.
Right, which is kind of the complaint from America's point of view. In other words, that it's costly to be the party imposing the sanctions, and that if there are benefits from the sanction regime, if something good happens in Iran as a result of this, not that I'm betting on that right now,
right.
But that China then is a kind of a free rider. You know, they got whatever benefits there would be from that result without paying the price. Now, is there a fear in China that it might be susceptible to sanctions? If they became more prevalent, or is there that kind of concern, or is it really a more consistent kind of objection than that?
Well, I think there is a concern in the country that it will impact China's business interests. That's most definite. I have a number of colleagues who work for Chinese oil companies and other companies who actually I know recently have been having meetings on the weekends about the Iran issue. I'm not privy to what happens within these meetings, but I would imagine very high on the agenda is exactly how are these sanctions, first of all, as they're being implemented by the West, impacting China, and if China signs on, how will that impact their business? So I'd say that from a business standpoint, it's a serious concern. But of course, there are also stability issues, as I mentioned, and larger political ones where they're trying to essentially avoid having what happened in Libya and elsewhere start to happen in Iran.
Right, and is there a concern that China itself could, in principle, be the target of sanctions? In other words, you know, that there are issues, whether they're human rights issues or whatever. That, you know, does it kind of fear a global sanctions, you know, regime run amok, kind of, you know, from its point of view?
Right. I think that's always been a concern for China, but China, frankly, is already suffering from sanctions in a number of different areas. It's not the country itself; it's individual industries within China, from a technological standpoint and otherwise. I mean, there's of course the.
What are some examples of that?
Well, the most obvious example is, for example, companies like Norinco, which have in the past been engaged in trade with what the United States deems as being nefarious entities, globally speaking. And when that happens, these individual companies have been sanctioned. And so I think, you know, whether or not the entire Chinese government as a whole would be sanctioned is another issue. But certainly I would say from a company standpoint, no company wants to be on the other end of sanctions. And there is, of course, the EU in the U.S. arms ban on China, which applies to a number of different fields. You know, when we talk about an arms ban, it's not just about weapons or anything like that. There is a palpable impact on other industries as well that are civilian or dual use.
And do you have a kind of prediction then? I mean, I guess I'm kind of sensing one, that not a lot is going to happen as a result of these appeals for China to get on board with the sanctions. Am I correct in thinking that that's your guess?
Well, I think that the issue that's going to come for China is, you know, what is the other option? You know, if this is the worst case scenario, or if they wish to avoid the worst case scenario, which would be some form of military altercation pertaining to Iran, then perhaps sanctions are the one option. I mean, they're pretty much the only option that's being offered up by the West at this particular time. So I think for China, coming from that standpoint, they may feel a good deal of pressure to actually do something. The extent to which they would sign on to sanctions, though, I think would be limited. The extent to which they would implement them would also suffer a number of constraints. And like I said earlier, I think there are always ways around sanctions. So I think that you know, the effectiveness of the sanctions is really hard to say. I think that they would be limited.
So if they became convinced, for example, that Israel was going to strike in the absence of more broad-based sanctions with more buy-in or something, then they might get on board.
Yeah, I think there's always that chance that they will, because I think there's, you know, when you're faced with a whole litany of worst-case scenarios or bad options, you're always going to try to pick the least bad of those options, or the least poor option, and this would be that in this instance.
And this emphasis on stability, I mean, you often hear that about the way China thinks of its internal situation.
Right.
But I mean, is it a genuine? Is it a concern that's kind of, you know, as applied globally? You know, I mean, Iran is a long way away from China. I mean, is it a global concern more than it is for a country like the United States? Stability, I mean.
I think, you know, obviously it is often applied regionally, this idea of stability, but I think when it's perceived from China, it actually feeds back into a much larger principle. They usually apply principles in various settings, right? One of the principles is this whole idea of non-interference, sovereignty of a country. So that's been a core principle of China for a long time. Now, it's a double-edged sword. It sounds good, but it can also prevent China from getting involved in a lot of issues. But I think that their concerns about stability are real, no matter how far away Iran is. Because ultimately, for them, I mean, we are living in a globalized world, and anything that shocks the system within Iran or the Middle East in terms of pricing of their oil is going to impact them at home in a very real way. So, in fact, I was just actually on a Chinese talk show on Phoenix television recently talking about these issues on Iran. And one of the things that struck me were the number of times that business interests came up and whether or not prices on oil that was sold to China would go up. So I think, you know, and this was coming from political scientists who usually just look at the large strategic picture. They were very concerned about, I would say, very particular specific issues pertaining to China's economy and what this would do to the oil market.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I guess some people would say that for China, foreign policy is economic policy in the sense that economic relationships with other nations and ensuring access to resources, economically vital resources globally and so on, you know, seem to take precedence over some of the kinds of considerations that play more prominently in American foreign policy, right? Is that a fair...
Yeah, I think, you know, I do think that they still look at the bigger picture. Obviously, they can't ignore it. But I think actually when they look at these things, I think there is actually a tendency to look at them holistically, but there is a definite, I would say there's an emphasis on the economic side because they're still growing. They still regard themselves as a developing country. And from that standpoint, they can't really afford to have a massive shock to the system. That's why, in fact, if you look at coverage of Iran right now, I would say within China, I've been struck by how pervasive it is. There's actually, I was, just before I did that interview that I just talked about, or that talk show, I remember tuning into the television to try to pick up what was on the Chinese news, and everything was about Iran. I mean, there was
really
program after program on Iran. And part of this stems into the very real concerns that they have, and part of this stems into the fact that this is an election year in China as well. Now, obviously, their election runs very differently from that in the United States. But what you see is kind of I would say the focus is opposite or turned on its head within China. Within the United States, my impression while I am in China is that there's a lot of focus on the economy, on what's going on internally in the United States. The United States has, in essence, during the election season, turned inward. Now, in China, you have a change in leadership that's coming, but for them, what they're actually looking at is outward. They're looking towards what's happening in other countries. Now, this is in part because it's looking inward has its own sensitivities, and it's easier to look outward, I would say, during an election year. So I think with Xi Jinping, as you mentioned earlier, coming into office, there is an added value to focusing more on what's happening in the outside world.
Okay, and he's a year away from coming into office, roughly?
Well, the transition would begin this year.
It would, okay.
Yeah.
So the coverage of Iran you're seeing this on TV stations that are in one sense or another connected to the government by and large?
Well, they're all in Chinese. They're all Chinese stations to begin with, and all stations within China. You know, the thing is that if you're watching a news program within China, that same news program will be broadcast on all the various channels for all the. So it would be like watching NBC on every channel. and
there's only one kind of news source of news that shows up on all the channels, or there are different kind of sources of news that show up on different channels?
They're definitely different stations. You know, as I mentioned before, I was on Phoenix Television, which is based in Hong Kong, and so you do have other options. But there is definitely one news program that, say, at 7 p.m. if you turn into your TV. Oh, in fact, I just did this last night. If you turn on your TV and you look at all the various stations, that will be the news broadcast.
So there's no escaping that news broadcast unless you just turn off the TV at 7 o'clock.
Exactly.
And that is that a kind of a fairly direct product of the government, or just something that is, in one sense or another, constrained by what is considered acceptable by the government?
I would say there are definitely some constraints on that officially sanctioned news program. You know, that's pretty much, I would never say it's the voice of the party or something like that. But you can tell from the programming and the way that they cover the news, it tends to be fairly dry, that there's actually, it's probably coming from the government. At the same time, a lot of these programs that I mentioned earlier on Iran are from all kinds of different sources within China. I mean, there is a plurality of voices within China, and don't get me wrong on that point. But the official news program is most definitely another issue. I would say that if you tune in at any particular time, and if you have cable within China, you can see a wide range of programming.
Okay. And is it possible to characterize the kind of the drift of the Iran coverage you're seeing, and whether there's much diversity of perspective, and if not, what the prevailing perspective is?
I would say that beyond the stability issue, of course, that I mentioned earlier, and that word will be repeated throughout, when you watch any of these programs, I would say that from a larger standpoint, what they're really looking at is the political dynamics of this and how it's going to shake out. While there is a concern, obviously, about economic issues, and they will bring up the oil issue and everything else, they still are really focused on the political machinations of the whole program. Now, being someone who works on nuclear issues, what's striking to me from a technical standpoint is that there's really only a focus on enrichment. Has Iran basically passed the Rubicon? Has it moved into the point where we should be concerned about it developing nuclear weapons? Has it enriched to that level? And
that's the question being addressed in the Chinese coverage.
Yes, and the thing about that is enrichment is one of these things which is inherently dual use. It lends itself to saying, well, it's still a civilian program. They haven't passed that red line, in other words. But the fact remains is that there isn't a tendency then to talk about all the other indicators that are out there. You have basically an IAEA report that came out in November of last year. And while there is mention of that report, you don't really hear so much about, say, the nuclear test simulations that were conducted in 2008 and 2009. There's a tendency, even interestingly, to refer back to the national intelligence estimate that came out of the United States in 2007, which says that Iran, for all intents and purposes, ended its pursuit, or at least put on hold its pursuit of nuclear weapons in 2003. So they're actually they're hewing themselves closer to that U.S. report than they are to the IAEA report, which is interesting.
So the tendency is to downplay the imminence of the development of an actual nuclear weapon by Iran.
I would say so, yes. Yeah.
So kind of the opposite of, say, Fox News in the United States.
Yes. But at the same time, too, they downplay that side, but they definitely play up, I would say, the chances of a conflict erupting or destabilization, or that they should be concerned about all of this. I think that there is a palpable concern, but in terms of what Iran is undertaking with its own program, there is still the tendency to give them the benefit of the doubt.
Okay, that's interesting. And do you get a sense that that public opinion, that there's actually much interest in this, at the popular level, and if so, whether public opinion actually constrains in any way what the government can do, or is it more the kind of thing that mainly elites care about, and the government has a lot of leeway and in any event can exert enough influence on public opinion to ensure that it can do what it wants in this realm?
I think that, when it comes to public opinion and the man on the streets, that type of opinion about the Iran issue, say, or any of the issues that are going on globally right now, they're interestingly enough, I find people to be pretty well plugged in, more so than you might expect. In fact, more so than you might expect if you went to, say, Anytown, USA, and asked someone a question about what was happening in the global spectrum. I think people are pretty aware. It is filtered, however, of course, to a certain degree. But this being said, with the rise of blogs and all these different things that people can use as a vehicle to get information, that means that at the same time, too, they are exposed to more ideas. And I think that they do exert an influence. Hence why I think it's so important, or seen as so important, to try to shape how people are looking at this issue. I mean, the government still makes its effort, as I mentioned before, with those, with the news programs. But I would say that actually the majority of the populace is probably not necessarily getting its information from the news programs. I think a lot of people probably tune them off. While I'm turning them on, they're probably turning off those same stations and watching something else online. So that of course, creates more flux in the system. But I think there is a preoccupation with this issue here, but lately it's actually been trumped, I would say, in the last week or so, even more by Syria. So there's a move back and forth between issues. There's not one that, say, dominates entirely the airwaves.
Okay. And these other sources of information aside from TV, we've heard a lot about Chinese attempts to kind of control the internet and certainly exert more influence on it than the United States government does. But at the same time, I assume that these sources of information, blogs and so on, are less under the influence of the government than conventional TV?
Oh, certainly, yeah. I would say certainly, because anything, but now there are efforts to force people to register. Once you have to start registering for things, even if it serves a function of, there's the censorship that comes from the government, but there's also a tendency once you've registered to be self-censoring. To be more conscious of the fact that somebody may be monitoring you, even if no one's monitoring you.
Because they will now know who you are.
Yeah, exactly. And once people start to know who you are, there are repercussions potentially for something you post online. And then you start to get an instance where actually the system starts to create self-censorship. And I think that the Chinese government has probably been fairly adept at creating that sense of, well, maybe I shouldn't say this, or maybe I shouldn't post that opinion because it could have repercussions for me.
So the government is trying to make anonymity impossible.
I wouldn't say entirely, but I would say they're definitely trying to make people more conscious of the fact that they aren't as anonymous as they would like, to put it diplomatically.
But this attempt is very much a work in progress right now. I gather the jury's kind of out on whether it's going to work.
Well, the thing is that they're just like sanctions that we were talking about earlier. There's always ways around various firewalls and things that are put into place. For example, I'm talking to you right now through a VPN because I get a clearer signal, obviously, that takes me past the firewall. And I'm certainly not the only person within China who uses a VPN to talk with the outside world. So I think that there's quite a few people within China who
do. Remind us what a VPN is?
A VPN is essentially, I'm not even sure what it stands for, but it's a virtual system that allows you to, it tricks your system into thinking that, say, you're in New York or Seattle or somewhere else in the world.
So PN could stand for proxy network or something.
There you go.
I doubt it, but it could.
No, I think you're probably right.
That's all interesting. So on balance, now you've been in China how long?
I've been in China on and off since 1997. And this time around, I've been here since 2006, since I was doing the PhD at Tsinghua.
So 97 is when the Internet was probably first starting to have, that's not long after it was first starting to have an impact in the United States. So have you noticed, on balance, a loosening up since then of what both what people can get away with saying and also how diverse their sources of information are and how porous, the Chinese border is to information from outside?
Well, I think that the porousness of the border actually, when we discuss that, we would go back to 1997 when I was first here. It really, internet and everything else hadn't reached that pitch, that it has now.
Right.
I think what you're seeing is more a function of the system itself, of internet becoming more pervasive, that everyone can basically get online. Where in the past, certainly when I was here in the late 90s, and I remember being here in 1999 and 2000, and I would go to an internet cafe, because that was one of the few places you could get online. And at the internet cafes, people, basically people who were sitting next to me at the cafe who were Chinese would often ask me to help them type in pinyin. Pinyin is the romanization of Chinese characters, because they weren't familiar with using that system in that way. They weren't familiar with coming online. So this was already in the late 90s. People were starting to go online, but it was certainly not the way it is now, where you have people within remote parts of China in internet cafes sitting at those internets. You probably have heard about this. People sit at the computers all day long. They have, the youth of China basically plugged in 24/7 into the internet. That I certainly didn't see during the 90s. But that, I don't know that I saw that in the United States during the 90s either. I think it's really a function of the system now becoming so global.
So as more people have gotten access to the Internet over the last 15 years, would you say that government has more trouble controlling the information people get and that people do have access to a broader array of information sources?
Most definitely. Yeah, I think that's just a natural, and for them, and they probably consider it an unfortunate development, it's something they can't control.
And then what about in the realm of expression since 1997? Not the access to information, but the freedom of expression.
I'd say across the boards, there has been a loosening up in terms of expression in all forms, whether it be artistic or otherwise. In fact, it's interesting, and I would say the past decade, it's become, I would say, to be subversive to an audience, right? So there's a fair number of people, who I think Ai Weiwei and all these folks who come out of China and who make a big splash in the West. There's certain segments of the population here that are watching that as artists and otherwise who see that as kind of their, not necessarily ticket out, but in some cases, yes, their ticket to the mainstream and to getting the outside world's attention. So you see some, I would say that, for example, in music scenes, if you talk about, there are a number of music pop groups and rock groups and indie rock bands within China, in fact, that intentionally insert subversive messages into their music, but don't necessarily, I wonder to what extent they actually buy into that, and to what extent it's marketed for, say, an external audience.
What's an example of a message that would be considered subversive and might sneak into a song or something?
For example, there's a group in China that's called Car Sick Cars, and they perform regularly at D22s, which is by Tsinghua University. And this particular group has a song called Zhongnanhai, which is, in this song, when they marketed it, they had on the cover a pack of cigarettes, because that's a kind of cigarette in China called Zhongnanhai. Very cheap, everyone can buy it on the market. But Zhongnanhai is also a reference to Zhongnanhai, which is the seat of power, which is on the main street, Chang'anjie, right off of Tiananmen Square, where the leadership sit, essentially. And so they use that type of reference to kind of indicate a form of subversion. They act like they're talking about cigarettes, but everyone knows that they're talking.
Did they say, we're going to smoke blank, and the double entendre is like blow up the leadership or smoke a cigarette, or no? Nothing quite that subversive.
It's probably not that extreme. There's definitely there are references in it that I don't think the party would enjoy.
Huh. Okay. So you mentioned Syria. Well, actually, one more kind of abstract question about public opinion before we move on to Syria is: to what extent is the government? I mean, we've said that the government is less able to control public opinion than it used to be able to, and to what extent is the government actually constrained in its policies, foreign policies and domestic policies, by this public opinion? Notwithstanding the fact that it's not, a democracy as we mean the term in America.
Well, I think most definitely, if you look at, for example, I'm trying to think of a good example of this. I would say that actually they are constrained. It's not constrained in the sense of, yes, we will vote you out of office constrained. It's constrained more in the sense of how are they going to get people on board with their agenda or how they deal with a certain issue. The perfect example I can think of is if we talk about, say, the unrest, and I don't want to get too much into unrest in China, but there have been a number of protests in the country. There have been issues in Xinjiang and Tibet, and when these come up, there's a tendency, I would say, in the popular audience to say that the government should be harder on these issues, that the government needs to take a firmer stance, a harder line. So actually, and that's actually, that voice has been fairly strong, and I think that, it's been constraining in the sense that the government then feels that, well, they have to respond in some form or another. If they're being too weak, then it's seen as an overall statement of the government's weakness on any one issue. So I would say in some cases that the popular opinion does exert its own influence, and it can actually contrary to probably Western perception, exert an influence which actually would make the government consider harsher action. Now, so I think we have to temper what we say when we say, well, yes, we want everyone to have a voice. It is great and it is wonderful for everyone to have a voice. That voice may not exactly be what the West wants to hear, though.
Well, right, and talk about that a little in terms of policy toward America. I mean, I assume that America is not universally beloved by the Chinese people, but maybe I'm. I mean, I got a very, very warm reception there. I've got to say, when I was in Beijing, they loved us to death. But at the same time, I hear about Chinese nationalism, not just as something that's directed to America in a necessarily antagonistic fashion, but as something that can be pretty fierce.
Sure. Well, the thing is I would say if we're talking about the perception of the United States here, I would say that it's conflicted. When I speak with most people, it used to be most definitely if you told people that you were from the United States, cab drivers or otherwise, they would give you the thumbs up and say that America is good. More recently, I would say, given in the wake of what happened in Libya and concerns over what's going on in Syria, which we'll talk about in a few minutes, I would say that the tendency is to say, you're from the U.S. That's really? About the response you get.
So Libya was a kind of a watershed. I mean, maybe that overstates it, but that's interesting because Libya, by the standards of our recent interventions, Libya kind of happened pretty fast in a certain sense. And the perception here is that in retrospect, it went fairly smoothly, although I don't think if you lived in Libya right now, you'd think that you had, you acquired eternal stability.
Right.
But still, the perception here is that it was almost like a blip. And it's interesting that in China it's viewed as a very big thing. Why is it viewed that way?
Well, I think there are a number of reasons. It depends on which aspect we're talking about with Libya. And I think the response here, first of all, I should say, I think has been similar to what I see coming out of Russia. And this is going to touch once again on the Syria issue. We're going to get to in a few minutes, because I would say within both countries, Libya is being perceived as, first of all, I don't think either country would have expected the Obama administration to engage in that form of what they view as a destabilizing, aggressive act against Libya. It's further concerning because they see it as an infringement upon that country's sovereignty. They also see it as destabilizing. Of course, as we already mentioned, as part of that mantra within China, it's an assault on that. Even more so from the nuclear standpoint, since we were just talking about Iran, the fact is Libya gave up its nuclear weapons program 8 years ago, and giving up your nuclear weapons program apparently with this altercation then becomes tantamount to giving up not only your sovereignty but even your leadership. It's seen as, I would say, I think there are major concerns that stem from what it's kind of signal it's sending to the international community, and that it can actually engage in this kind of act of aggression. That's how it's perceived here, as an act of aggression, and it certainly wasn't seen as a smooth one either. I think that people are really looking at the after effects and what's happening in Libya now, and it kind of feeds back into this whole sense that supporting an insurrection, a rebel group, any form of insurgency it's a double-edged sword. At the end of the day, you may have backed the wrong side, and you're not backing the majority. Most of the people that I've spoken to, like the man on the street, right, within China, would say that, well, when you look at this, in all these countries, in all these situations, the majority of the people probably in that country still supported the leadership. You have a certain percentage which did not. And if you support that percentage to overturn the majority, that is ultimately a destabilizing act. And of course, I mean, as I've already mentioned, this impinges upon issues of Xinjiang, Chechnya for the Russians, for China it's Xinjiang. Certainly they don't want to see themselves at the receiving end of that in the future, where the international community decides to support a certain percentage of the population against the majority, against the leadership.
Okay, you want to quickly fill us in on Qinguan, or which I failed to pronounce correctly, but the word you just said. You want to give us the 30-second background?
Oh, okay. Well, Xinjiang, the whole issue of Xinjiang, I think, and Tibet, they're usually linked together. Xinjiang is, of course, the northwestern part of China, and has a predominantly Muslim population. And so you can start to see where parallels might start to come out. It has historically been an area of unrest. But it's perceived within China, certainly since the Qing dynasty, as having been incorporated into China. Now,
has been settled pretty heavily by ethnic Chinese, I think, right?
Right. There have been efforts to... Go ahead.
Yeah. Well, they kind of sent a lot of ethnic Chinese there over the years, and I guess that's one source of tension within the province. But
there are numerous sources of tension within the province, but certainly there have been incidents, let's put it that way, in the past few years. Certainly, I would say that because of the spotlight that was shown on China with the Olympics, there was a tendency then for different groups, not just within Xinjiang, but also in Tibet, to try to make bigger pushes for their interests in those different regions. So there's always a concern within China that they could be the next. I wouldn't say that they're concerned about being the next Libya, but they're certainly concerned about the precedent that Libya sets for other countries that are dealing with internal domestic disputes. And they have a point. I mean, the fact is if there was a group, say, in Florida that decided that it wanted to secede from the United States and took up weapons against the U.S. government, and China were to support that group, give it weapons, I don't know that the United States would look very favorably upon China in this instance or see it in a stabilizing light.
I think we would oppose that intervention.
Yes, probably, yes.
Personally, I'm not sure I'd be averse to secession, but that's just me. So, I think what's interesting is that China, like Russia, actually signed on to the Security Council resolution, or I forget what they voted for, but at least did not veto it. The Security Council resolution that authorized the Libyan intervention, but I think there may be a sense in China of a kind of bait and switch, because I assume that they think that the Western powers actually exceeded the mandate, which was about protecting civilians after the intervention, right? And it started to seem more like a regime change effort, which it became. Is that a big issue there?
No, I think that's a fair characterization. I think so. So when you have this situation where you have even in the international community, because China likes having, obviously, China's very pro-UN, pro-United Nations mandate. They want the international community to be on board. They're very much against unilateral action. This is why they were so concerned about, under the Bush administration, you have Iraq, you have all these unilateral actions coming out from the U.S. without a coalition, so to speak. So you actually have a coalition in this state, in a sense. They started to come on board with that, and then what does the group do? It does something which they see to be ultimately tantamount to regime change. That was ultimately behind everything that was going on. So right now with Syria, it's the same thing. This is why they see basically a repeat happening, and they don't necessarily want to be on board, and they aren't on board, as we know already with their response along with Russia to UN mandate.
Yeah. Now, that, of course, wasn't a resolution for intervention. It was a resolution that would have called upon the Syrian president to step down, which, of course, he would not have done. It was not a resolution that had any teeth. But I gather the concern in China is that, it's kind of a slippery slope once you start authorizing these things in these resolutions. It can become a slippery slope to intervention. Or was the feeling that just, hey, you don't have the right to ask the guy to step down. He's the president. It's not clear that this is a majority that wants to unseat him. The people who want to unseat him are using weapons, which, is frowned on in some countries, and so on. Right. Is that the kind of thing you hear?
No, I think that's a fair characterization. The fact is once again, it's an infringement upon this country's sovereignty to for its leadership to have to ask it to step down. No one has that right from the outside world, in their opinion. And yes, I don't think that they see this as a nonviolent opposition to the government. I think they see it as something else, and that there are dangers to supporting such forms of insurrection. And frankly, I think they also, we talk about precedents here. There's certainly precedents for the West in the past supporting the wrong course or trying to affect change in a country, say, supporting the Mujahideen in Afghanistan, where there are concerns that I think are actually very relevant as to why this might be a slippery slope, as you mentioned, and going down the wrong road, and that it might not just be this one. Since they know that essentially he's not going to step down just from the international community telling him to, they know that that's just the first step to a more possibly aggressive act.
So we should not expect, in your view, any greater participation from China in any efforts at the UN to do something about Syria. I think there's a sense that Russia may be reconsidering a little, that may have been shamed by Hillary Clinton and Susan Rice, or shamed by that in conjunction with the very kind of vivid violence that's been playing out on televisions. Television screens. Maybe Russia is going to be shamed into kind of reconsidering, but you would not expect that in China?
I think if Russia does come on board, if Russia is shamed into this position, it will put China in a much more sensitive position. China doesn't like to be isolated in the international community. They aren't going to want to be the one voice that says no. That just isn't, that's not the way the system works. So I think that here they would probably be more likely to look upon it in a different light if Russia starts to. But at the same time, too, I think there's still a degree of autonomy. It's not that, say, Russia does something and then China's going to come on board with it. While the two tend to be in line with each other, they see eye to eye, I think there's a mutual reinforcing aspect to that. So if Russia does start to take a more tends to come in line with the United States or other countries on this, China may start to reconsider. However, I think there's going to be a tremendous amount of convincing on this, because frankly, when you see coverage of Syria here, you're not seeing the coverage of all of these acts of violence within the country, or you don't see it. You don't see it as much, I would say, as in the West, where there's so much of a focus on that. It's more talking about the destabilization of the country writ large, So and if they're talking about the violence that's going on, they're also talking about it from the standpoint of, well, the aggressor is not just the government, the aggressor is also this insurrection, these insurgents. And so they actually see them as the instigators of basically the government has to do something. How is the government going to deal with this? And who has the right to tell the government that it's dealing with it incorrectly?
Okay, so the story playing out on American TV screens, which is, the city of Homs being brutalized, in a kind of inexcusable way, and that story being conveyed vividly, that's not playing on Chinese TV screens, it sounds like. Is that playing on the internet in China at all? I mean, in video form, possibly, or not?
I'd say there's some coverage. I wouldn't say, but it's definitely, in the U.S., obviously I've been in China for a while now, but I'm always struck by when I go back to the U.S. and I watch CNN or something, you are constantly assaulted with these images, right? And they replay those news reels over and over and over again, and it's hard not to get the message. In China, there will obviously be references to it. They will show a brief image of what's going on in the country, say in Syria that pertains to the violence. But there's no barrage of that on TV. When you hear them talking about it, certainly on both TV and radio, I would say it's more about what the international community is trying to do, that they're putting pressure on the government, that this is, once again, the word stability comes out. This is an issue of stability and sovereignty. And so there's a pretty strong, I would say there's a pretty strong effort to shape how people are looking at it, and it's not necessarily, I'd say in both countries it's the same thing, though. I'd say in the U.S. there's certainly an effort to shape how people are looking at it and to get people on board with this agenda that the U.S. has and why it might, take other actions in the future. In China, I think they're trying to get the general public on board with why they won't take certain actions in the future and why they won't necessarily get on board with that agenda.
Okay. So just broadening the focus a little bit, zooming out a little bit, what about the Arab Spring more broadly, of which, Syria is ultimately kind of an expression, I guess? I would think that in the government there are some concerns about the kind of thing that represents. What about at the popular level? Is there any kind of verdict? I mean, when it started out in the United States, there was a lot of enthusiasm about it. As it has played out and turned out to be more complicated than people had hoped, there's more ambivalence maybe. But how does that compare with popular opinion in China?
Well, obviously, there was a good deal of discussion about the Arab Spring, I would say, at an academic level. There were conferences that were convened about it. There was an interest in it from, I would say it was more of an academic interest. I didn't see it playing out in the popular media so much because obviously there were concerns within China about similar movements here.
So it wasn't getting a lot of
revolution
TV time.
and so on. Yeah, within China they have a vested interest in avoiding something similar happening in China in terms of Jasmine Revolution or what have you. I think for the most part, but it doesn't mean that there wasn't an interest in what this meant more broadly for the region. I think, though, that once again there is a concern about it being stabilizing, and when you look at what's going on in Egypt and elsewhere, I think that there are ultimately, from the start, I think I saw more of I wouldn't call it a realistic assessment, but I think that there were more cautionary voices as to what this might lead to as the next level. Would it lead to a certain form of chaos? Would it lead to a worsening of the economic situation? Would it lead to a certain degree of lawlessness in some of these countries? And I think that to a certain extent, when we see these things play out, when you see the potential negative after effects, it's very easy then within China to say, aha, you see, we told you so.
Well, maybe they did. Okay, we're getting close to the limit of our time, but is there anything else you want to talk about quickly? Particularly issues that might impinge on the U.S.-China relationship. I guess the one thing you read about sometimes here are these these disputed islands and so on. That's considered potentially a sensitive point. And China has disputes with various neighbors about various islands, I gather. But is that something we should be concerned about?
Well, I think it's less an issue of, say, these territorial disputes or the Spratlys or certain islands that China is concerned about. Obviously, these territorial issues have been around for decades, actually, and longer than that. I think what in China the big interest is right now is in this idea of the U.S. pivot towards Asia. And this came out most vividly, I would say, in comments and also an article in Foreign Policy that came out from Hillary Clinton, which was America's Pacific Century, was the name of the article. And that really, I think, started this snowball effect within China of an interest in, now that the United States is perceived as having is moving away from Iraq, Afghanistan, these other issues, and starting to put its focus both militarily, politically, economically on Asia. What does that mean for China's rise? Is it meant to contain China's rise? And so I think that when they talk about these islands or any of these territories, when you talk about the South China Sea, that's tantamount, that's pointing to these much larger issues of how is the United States willing to allow China to rise, if it even has that capability or power, and what kind of influence is it going to accept China having within the region, and so I think most recently, for example, when that article came out, the immediate response that you saw come out from, say, major generals within the Chinese military, they would publish pieces in Xinhua and elsewhere. They said this is not just about the South China Sea dispute. This is not just about territories. This is about a larger agenda the U.S. has, its relationship with India, strengthening its relationship with Japan and South Korea. It's also about its cooperation with Australia. You have this sending of Marines to Australia. They see a very effective circle being set up around their perimeter, Central Asia as well, set up by the United States, and it's worrisome from a Chinese perspective is what the U.S.
worried about? What are they worried about happening? Are they worried about conflict, kind of inadvertently breaking out? Are they worried about being kept from doing some things they would like to do?
Well, I don't know that they're necessarily worried in the interim about conflict. I don't get that impression. Obviously there are probably some extreme voices that might talk about the potential for conflict, but certainly the U.S. presence, and particularly the U.S. reconnaissance activities conducted by the Navy, the Air Force within the region, this whole idea of air-sea battle does have a conflict-prone, core to it that I think is always lying there. And they're concerned about whether or not the U.S. might actually engage in some form of altercation, whether it be over Taiwan or otherwise in the future, and willing to take China on. China's finally getting to the point where they're building up their Navy. They feel like they're able to start protecting some of their economic interests abroad. And if the United States comes in and starts to impinge upon those interests, China won't have quite the same scope that it wants. And so what you see is with the U.S. trying to build up its or strengthen some of its relationship, whether it be relationships with Vietnam, countries in Southeast Asia, which touches back upon this territorial issue that you mentioned. As that occurs, you see that China is also trying to reinsert itself. It's through soft power, what have you, to try to reinsert itself in the region and regain some of what it might lose in terms of its foothold. Because ultimately, if you go to Southeast Asia, I've been to a number of countries in Southeast Asia, and there's a tremendous Chinese influence. From infrastructure, roads, everything. There tend to be signs. For example, if you go to Laos, there's signs by the side of the road. This road was constructed by China. There was a poppy field here once, and it was eradicated by China. If those signs start to be replaced by U.S. signs, that say the United States came in and did something or other in Laos or wherever, I think that that's ultimately what China's more concerned about is the soft power influence, that it's finally regaining some of that or regaining some of its stature in the region, and all of a sudden the U.S. is suddenly trying to contain or encircle it. I would say that's the discourse within China right now.
Yeah. And is it clear to you what the United States is concerned about happening? I mean, there are the disputed islands, and, there's the concern about, for one thing, that leading to conflict, leaving aside the concern about people's property getting taken who deserve it, maybe. But aside from that, is it clear to you what the American concern is?
I think, ultimately, I think the U.S. is right in having its a refocus on Asia. I think that it's been pushed to the back burner a good deal by what's been going on in the Middle East and elsewhere, by the Afghanistan issue, by Iraq, and all these things. And I think that the U.S. Has returned in a way, and this is something that Robert Kaplan likes to say, that this was what was intended after the end of the Cold War, that the U.S. was going to have a bigger presence in Asia, and now it's just naturally readjusting itself to something which it had originally planned. This is not something which is abnormal or shouldn't be expected. Asia is a tremendous area of growth economically, which for the United States right now is a significant issue if we talk about that turning inward that I mentioned earlier. And so they're obviously going to be looking to Asia as an engine of growth for not just the Asian economies, but also for the U.S. economy. And you can't ignore that region anymore, not just from a military standpoint, but from an American standpoint. But there are other factors that impinge upon U.S. policy there as well. I do believe that there are countries that within the region, within Southeast Asia, that see bringing the United States in to play a bigger role to be in their interest. And I think they have sought out U.S. participation in the region in this regard. But it wouldn't be the first time that smaller countries, say, have used two powers to play one off of each other to try to gain something out of that. And it feeds into not just how the U.S. conducts itself, but also, for example, India's cooperation with Vietnam. The U.S. is not the only player who's reorienting itself towards Asia Pacific.
Okay. Well, listen, I wish we did have more time to talk about this because it's all been very interesting. You've done a great job of giving us a whirlwind tour of China's perspective on various global issues. And I hope maybe you'll be able to come back and join us again. Even though this has involved you getting up at an ungodly hour by normal human reckoning.
Well, I appreciate that.
What time is it? What time is it in Beijing right now?
It's 6 a.m. in Beijing right now. So that's not too bad. This is about the time I should normally be getting up.
Yeah, but you didn't get up now. You got up more than an hour ago. That's the problem. But you've been remarkably alert. You haven't fallen asleep during any of my questions.
I appreciate that.
And I appreciate it. Okay, so thanks so much, Lora, and we'll see you next time.
All right, terrific. Thank you.
Okay, bye-bye.
Take care. Bye.